Breaking, Russia just crossed a red line, NATO must respond. Right now, tensions between Russia and NATO have hit a fever pitch. Events are unfolding fast, statements are getting sharper, and what was once a boundary of deterrence now seems to have been breached. Today, we're going deep into what Russia has done, why it's being called a red line, how NATO is reacting and must react, and what this could mean for global stability. Let's break it down. Something major just happened. Russia sent a swarm of drones into Polish airspace. These weren't minor violations. Poland reported that 19 drones, likely Russian, made, penetrated its airspace during an ongoing attack on Ukraine. Some of these drones were shot down by Polish forces. The incursion triggered high alert across several regions. Airports were shut down in Warsaw, Lublin, Rzeszów, among others. Civilian areas saw damage and debris. Reuters +2, The Times of India +2. What makes this moment so critical is that Poland invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty. That's a big signal, not yet an invocation of Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, but Article 4 allows for members to consult when they feel their security is compromised. It's the alarm bell, the negotiation trigger, the alliance gathering moment. The Washington Post +1 now. Russia has denied that these incursions were intentional or part of a provocation. Some statements suggest electronic interference diverted these drones from Ukraine across the border. Poland and NATO do not accept those explanations. They say these are deliberate breaches that cannot go unanswered. AP News +1. So why is this being called crossing a red line? Because for NATO, this is not just a border violation, it's an attack on NATO territory. Until now, much of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, even when involving Western supplied weaponry or drone incursions, had been contained within Ukraine's borders or in contested zones. NATO member states have been supporting Ukraine, but direct engagement inside NATO territory is another matter entirely. This changes the calculus. It's no longer Russia vs. Ukraine, but Russia vs. NATO, at least in tangible terms. Wikipedia +2, Reuters +2 now. Let's pause to understand what red lines were already drawn by both sides before this incident. Russia has repeatedly warned NATO and the West about certain actions that it considers intolerable. Deployment of long-range missile systems in or near Ukraine, Western intelligence sharing that supports strikes into Russian territory, or any use of Ukrainian territory as a launch pad for weapons that threaten Russia's territorial integrity. Euronews +2, BBC +2. Putin in recent speeches has made it clear. If Ukraine with Western help uses long-range missiles to hit targets within Russian territory, that would be crossing a line. He makes a point of demanding that NATO does not allow deep strikes or enable them through data sharing or other operational assistance. He's also warned that if NATO moves forward with missile deployments close to Russia, especially intermediate-range systems, Russia will respond, lifting self-imposed restraints and taking actions that may escalate dramatically. BBC +1 From NATO's perspective, leaders have warned that Russia must not use nuclear weapons or escalate in ways that fundamentally change the nature of the war. Jens Stoltenberg and other NATO officials have said that certain Russian steps would cross very important lines and provoke strong countermeasures. The Economic Times +1. So this drone incursion is viewed by many as one of those moments where the previously theoretical becomes almost immediate. When drones cross into NATO airspace, when civilians are endangered, when the alliance's territorial integrity is challenged, that's when the warnings stop being just words. That's when the red line has been crossed. Now, what does this force NATO to do? Let's explore possible responses, both immediate and long-term, and the risks involved. First, immediate responses. Poland triggered Article 4, so there will be consultations among member states. We can expect statements of condemnation, demands for answers from Russia, possibly a formal diplomatic protest. NATO may deploy additional air defense assets to Poland's eastern provinces. Early warning systems will be heightened. Flights scrambled and rules of engagement refined so that future airspace violations can be addressed more swiftly. NATO might also increase surveillance and counter drone systems along its borders. Wikipedia plus 1 second economic and diplomatic pressure. Additional sanctions, restrictions on Russian activity in international airspace or over flights, further curtailments on trade, and coordination with the EU to isolate Russia more firmly. If there is evidence that Belarus facilitated the drone entry, diplomatic pressure could extend to Belarus as well. Wikipedia plus 1/3 military posture adjustments. NATO has already been building up forces in its eastern flank, especially in Poland, the Baltics, Finland, and through rotating deployments. This event may accelerate that with prepositioning more air defense systems, stronger rapid reaction forces, more exercises, and possibly staging of missile defense systems. Decision: makers will have to weigh how much to escalate without triggering open conflict. Reuters' fourth, strategic messaging. NATO must make clear which actions will be considered unacceptable in the future. Define those red lines for Russia or risk being caught off guard. Clarify what counts as an attack on NATO territory. How far can drone incursions go before invoking Article 5? What about hybrid warfare, cyber or sabotage, or other non-kinetic actions? Those questions are going to sharpen very fast. Sky News plus 1 let's also consider the risks involved. Escalation is dangerous. If NATO responds too aggressively, Russia might respond in kind. Retaliation could involve Russian missile strikes, airspace violations in NATO countries, cyber attacks, or even provocative nuclear posture changes. Moscow has already telegraphed that certain NATO support for Ukraine, especially around long-range missile systems, could provoke a Russian nuclear response. BBC plus 1 another risk miscalculation. Drone incursions, especially swarms, can be chaotic. The difference between unintentional straying and provocation is very thin, and Russia may claim misidentification or technical failure. NATO will need strong intelligence to clearly show that this crossing was deliberate if it wants international legitimacy for its response. Otherwise, arguments may shift to blame. A third risk: public panic and political pressure. Countries near the front lines will feel vulnerable. Populations in NATO member states might expect immediate retaliation, and governments may face pressure to act even when cautious, limited responses are strategically smarter. Diplomacy will be under strain. Allies may disagree about how far to go. Some might favor restraint, others demand strong action. Unity will be tested. What about long-term implications? We might be entering a new phase of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, one where the war is no longer almost entirely geographically bounded. If drone attacks, missile launches, or intelligence sharing from Western states routinely draw Russian responses, then the risk of direct confrontation between NATO and Russia becomes more concrete. The idea of Russian violation, Western response, will no longer be hypothetical. Also, NATO countries may change their own red lines. What used to be provocative yet tolerable in the sense of not triggering full conflict may now be intolerable. That could mean NATO expanding air defense budgets, increasing permanent deployments near borders, investing more in counter, drone tech, cyber defense, and hybrid warfare readiness. It also means that diplomacy must work harder. Back channels confidence, building measures, de-escalation talks, possibly a new kind of arms control framework might be demanded. Everyone will want to avoid worst-case scenarios. Now, stepping back, how did we get here? What trajectory of events led Russia to feel emboldened to cross that line, And how did NATO signal or fail to signal sufficiently? Over the past years, the war in Ukraine has evolved. Western support to Ukraine steadily increased, including arms, intelligence sharing, training, and more complex weapons. Ukraine asked for long-range missiles from the West. Russian warnings about going too far went unheeded or were dismissed in some circles. Putin has been warning that certain weapons systems, especially those Western, supplied, when used to strike inside Russian territory, constitute red lines. NATO's backing of Ukraine via weapons, parts, logistical, and financial aid has increasingly drawn Russia's ire. Meanwhile, incidents like drone overflights, cyber operations, and hybrid warfare, sabotage, etc., have chipped away at the threshold. Wikipedia +3, The Guardian +3, BBC +3, then came this latest incursion, 19 drones over Poland. That's different. NATO territory was directly affected, something visible, something many see as indisputable, and when that happens, rhetoric becomes action. The question now is, will NATO respond in a way that deters further violations, or will Russia interpret a weak response as permission? Let's think through how NATO must respond to maintain deterrence, credibility, and peace. First, NATO should clarify its red lines publicly. What is unacceptable? Drone incursions into NATO airspace, missile strikes, use of Baltic airspace to support Russian operations. The public needs to understand what's off limits. Without that clarity, both sides operate with dangerous ambiguity. Second, NATO must send a decisive message in this case, either through a strong diplomatic move or through military posture that reinforces NATO's resolve. Whether that's deploying more missile defense systems along the border, reinforcing air defense, making joint exercises more visible, or stationing assets that show NATO can respond quickly. Third, NATO should unify among its members. Disagreements among member states weaken deterrence. If Poland, the Baltics, Finland are requesting reinforcements, NATO as a bloc must show up. If some members are more cautious, they need to align so Russia cannot pick off responses piecemeal. Fourth, NATO must involve non-military lines of response, tougher sanctions, energy leverage, diplomatic isolation, legal actions, use economy, international law, and reputation as tools, because purely military escalation is risky, especially with a nuclear-armed adversary. Fifth, seek negotiation avenues. While preparing for worst-case outcomes, leaders should open back-channel communications, propose de-escalation frameworks, transparency about troop movements, joint monitoring of airspace violations, even agreements that drones must avoid certain zones or declare flight paths, or that there is neutral observation in contested airspace. These are hard, but necessary to reduce risk of miscalculations. What could happen next? Scenario 1, NATO responds with limited measures, perhaps stronger air defense deployment, more patrols and sanctions, but stops short of military retaliation. Russia responds by stepping up warnings, but likely avoids open conflict, at least for now. Scenario 2, a tit-for-tat escalation, more drone incursions, possibly over a NATO country's border, maybe missile overflights or strikes near border regions. NATO might retaliate in kind or impose significant military responses that risk escalation. Scenario 3, open confrontation. If Russia believes NATO is facilitating attacks into Russian territory, it might establish direct military operations near NATO borders. NATO might respond with force. And then we risk a dangerous misstep, perhaps one involving nuclear weapons or false alarms. What about worst case, a full-scale war between NATO and Russia? That remains unlikely given what we know. Russia is nuclear armed. NATO members are nuclear armed. The costs are astronomical. Neither side wants that outcome, but each side also fears losing credibility. Both want to avoid appearing weak. And in a world with adrenaline and fear running high, miscalculation is the greatest hazard. So, do we believe that NATO must respond? Yes, strongly. NATO cannot pretend this didn't happen. For alliance credibility, deterrence, for member confidence, for strategic stability, NATO must take a clear stand. It must show that territory matters, sovereignty matters, and that NATO protection is not just symbolic, but real. To viewers, this isn't just about war games, geopolitical chess, or remote threats. It's about safety in Eastern Europe, about how power is shifting globally, and about how fragile peace is when warnings are ignored. It's about how alliances must function not just in words, but in actions. Let me close with what each of us should watch closely in the coming days and weeks. Watch whether NATO countries issue a coordinated response beyond statements. Will there be new military deployments in Poland or the Baltics? Enhanced air defense systems. Are other nations invoking either Article 4 or even preparing for Article 5 in case of further violations? Watch speeches by Russian leaders, what justifications they give, whether they admit knowledge or responsibility, whether they double down on threat of nuclear or asymmetric retaliation. Watch for diplomatic efforts. Will there be offers of negotiation, or will things stay locked in antagonism? Will third parties attempt mediation? Watch economic fallout. Do new sanctions hit harder? Do supply chains shift? Do energy prices or shipments become a tool of leverage? And most importantly, watch for accidents or miscalculations. False alarms, misidentifications, drone crashes, radar glitches, any one of those could trigger a response far more significant than intended. Breaking, Russia just crossed a red line, NATO must respond, is not just a headline. It may be the moment when everything shifts direction. The warnings were there, the red lines were drawn. Now the test is whether NATO and the world will defend those lines with conviction. Thanks for watching. Please leave your thoughts. Do you think NATO will unite and act, or will this become another ignored warning? Is the world closer to confrontation now than ever before? See you in the next video.